Good evening. On behalf of Belmont Against Racism, the Belmont Human Rights Commission, and the Belmont Media Center, I welcome you to the discussion, Creating Change for Racial Justice. I'm Kathryn Bonfiglio, President of Belmont Against Racism. There are moments in history when change beckons and seems possible. This is one of those moments. George Floyd's death, coupled with the disparate effects of the pandemic on communities of color, seems to have sparked an awakening in our country. The reality is that this country can't survive as a democracy with the contradiction of our stated values of giving everyone dignity of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness if we continue to deny those very rights to Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples. For those of us who are white, we have the responsibility to shoulder the burden for change and to put the voices of people of color at the center of our discussions. For the young activists listening, we admire and need you. The multiracial, multi-ethnic demonstrations were an inspiration. We urge more of you. To paraphrase Brian Stevenson, we need people not just to care, we need people to vote and to engage in policy and political reform. We are here tonight to seek solutions for ending systemic racism in our community, our state, and our country. Demonstrations pointed to the frustration and anger with police brutality. But we know that racism is all aspects of our society, not just policing and the criminal justice system. Our responsibility for change includes areas of health, housing, the economy, education, the environment, the workplace, and voting rights. We want to turn from rhetoric to action. Tonight, we ask these community leaders for some of their ideas for concrete solutions as we go forward. Gianna Floyd, George Floyd's daughter, said, "Daddy changed the world." Let us seize this moment to make those changes a reality for her, her children, and her grandchildren. I now turn this over to our moderators and Belmont High School 2020 grads, Chloe Park and Gilchrist Imboywa. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. My name is Gilchrist Imboywa. I am a recent Belmont High School graduate. First of all, I would like to thank everyone for making this happen, BAR, Belmont Media Center, and everyone on the panel. I think it's about time for Belmont as a community to come together and start fighting for racial justice. A little bit about me. I will be attending Colby College next year to study government studies on a pre-law track. Again, I'm so thankful for being here, and thank you everyone for making this happen. I'm excited to be part of such a wonderful community that always has its front foot when it comes to fighting for justice. Thank you.
If Ms. Ryan and Mr. McIsaac, Ms. Haley Jackson and Mr. Brownsberger, and then Mr. Rogers may introduce themselves, please. Thank you.
Sure, happy to. Thanks so much for having me tonight. And thank you, Gilchrist and Chloe, for putting this together and for leading the discussion. I'm Marian Ryan. I'm the district attorney here in Middlesex County and also a resident of Belmont. So I'm always incredibly impressed by the work that you do at the high school. And thanks to Belmont Media for hosting us, as they so graciously do. And I think that, do you want us to speak a little bit right now, or do you want to just do the introductions first?
Go ahead, Marian, and speak now.
Okay. You know, Kathryn mentioned both how the murder of George Floyd and this pandemic, which so adversely affected people of color, were happening at the same time. And it does seem like there's all sorts of things going on, but I think two good pieces of that are, one of which, and the chief knows this well, some of the accommodations that we've had to make in police work and in our prosecution work because of this pandemic, I think have provided us with material to look at and to think about in terms of how we make very concrete change. And I've already had the opportunity to talk with Senator Brownsberger and Representative Rogers, who are great partners, about how do we institutionalize some of those things. And the second is that this obviously the way we're together tonight on Zoom, but being able to get people together so quickly has really allowed us to begin in our office having discussions about the relationships between all of the things that have arisen in these days between privilege and policing and race. And we've put together a curriculum for all 250 employees of our office. We've been meeting weekly, having those conversations. And the goal is to confront what makes us uncomfortable by thinking about that work that we're reading and looking at and relating that to our work. And what are real concrete steps? Because the most unfortunate, tragic thing would be to have something like this happen and not actually make concrete change. So some of the things that we are doing and are thinking about doing are, first of all, we really strive to have our office, our prosecutors and our staff reflect the communities that we serve. And we've done a real outreach over the last few years, which has resulted in a real change to our office, an office that, frankly, for a very long time was primarily white, and frankly, for a long time was also mostly male. And we've really made a big change around that. And part of that is giving us the opportunity to really have that racial equity lens that we're looking at our prosecutions with. And one of the things that's become clear to us is, although we've brought lots of folks into the office, we need a really senior person to bring that lens. So I've created a new position in the office, the Director of Racial Justice Initiatives. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to put that job out there. We're very actively seeking candidates for that job. It's posted on our website. We encourage everybody listening who cares about these issues to take a look. Please send folks our way. The other piece is that one of the things we have done, and I think the pandemic will allow us to do more. About 2 years ago, we really looked at the way cash bail, adversely affected communities of color. We changed our policy. The pandemic and the need to get people out of the institutions has allowed us to do a little bit more experimentation with that. We plan to incorporate that into changes, a further change in our bail policy when we go back. One of the other issues is during the pandemic, the police have been great partners in lots of minor crimes. People are being prosecuted for those crimes, but they're not being arrested. They're given summonses. And when you think about one of the things that is consistent in so many of the tragedies we've seen unfold is that at the heart of the incident that triggered the use of force is usually a very minor crime. You know, whether it's Mr. Floyd or any of the people that we've been talking about in the last few weeks, it isn't that the police were pursuing a murderer. It's things like $20, the fake $20 bill at a bodega. It's somebody selling a couple of cigarettes. It's the kinds of things that we've been dealing very effectively in Middlesex County here now for the last 3 months with summonses. And when you think about the fact that many of the people who are committing some of these offenses, these minor offenses, may have some substance issues, they may have some mental health issues. Attempting to arrest them, put cuffs on them, put them in the back of a wagon is not going to improve the situation. And those are the situations that often escalate to a place of tragedy. So that's something we're really looking to change. Another piece that's important is we have to be transparent about what we do. So we've begun a process here where if you go on our website, you can see a real deep dive about the racial background of people that we prosecute. You can see the number of people we're diverting. All of that is on our website, as well as any investigations we conduct into a lethal use of force in Middlesex County. All of that, the video, everything that we looked at is posted on our website. And we've taken that a step further in terms of those decisions should be reviewed by an independent person and a judge. That's what we do. We take cases to court. So we've begun using an inquest where a judge reviews the evidence in a use of force to make a determination of whether that case should proceed. That's the kind of transparency that gives people confidence. And related to that is our office keeps a very detailed Brady incidents where an officer might have engaged in some misconduct on the job. That list is public. And we keep that so that people can know that and know what's happening. Fortunately, that number compared to our overall number is very small, but it's important that that's out there, that people know about that. So we have forged a lot of great partnerships here in our county, whether with law enforcement or with our legislative partners, and it has served people well, and I'm hoping to implement these changes as well.
Thank you so much, DA Ryan, for that. Up next is Belmont Police Chief James McIsaac. Thank you very much. And for panelists, we'll only request for 2 minutes of your time. We'll have plenty of time to go deeper into these policies. Chief McIsaac.
All right. James McIsaac, Belmont Police Chief. I took over on January 1st for Chief McLaughlin. And, you know, I have to say one of the things that Chief McLaughlin did very well in his 12 and a half years as chief is we collaborated with a lot of different groups in town. We built relationships, and those relationships are strong. And I'm talking about groups with, you know, we've had a member sit on the Human Rights Commission. We have a good relationship with Belmont Against Racism. And those relationships and being challenged by those groups have made us a much stronger department, a much more secure department. And I think we're serving the town pretty well, but there's a lot of work to be done. As a district attorney said, one of the things with George Floyd that struck us was we got down to what was he being arrested for? I mean, we wouldn't even make an arrest in that situation here with what we're doing with summonses. And, you know, we've got a lot of work to do, though, and my main focus is here in Belmont. I've said it a number of times in the last few weeks, you know, that, you know, solving all these problems throughout the world are difficult, but it's a reality here in Belmont. We have the people, we have the power to do it, and we can make Belmont a community that's safe for everybody and where everybody feels welcome. And, you know, it was very heartbreaking to me after the George Floyd incident, when I talked to a couple of people that had sent me emails and talked to me, and there's a legitimate fear among people of color in Belmont of the police. And we just can't have that. You know, it's not right. It's not fair. And, you know, we're going to work to overcome that. There's a lot of, we're hearing a lot of different things, defund the police, come out. I just ask everybody to please be patient. I know the state legislator is working on a police officer standards law, which, you know, believe it or not, a lot of us in law enforcement have been looking for that for quite some time. You know, I'm often perplexed when this 8 Can't Wait came out and we met it, but I'm thinking, why aren't other communities meeting it? Why do we have a different use of force policy from a community next door to us? And so I think you're going to see some standardization. I think you're going to see some good things come out of the legislature as a result of this murder that was committed in Minneapolis. But, you know, transparency is another thing. You know, I'm here for anybody who has any questions, anything they want to know about what we do, why we do it. I'm always here. The staff at the Belmont Police Department is always here, and we'll provide any information that you'd like to know at any time. And we can be used as a resource. We'd like to partner in this and making our community a better place for everybody.
Thank you, Mr. McIsaac. Up next is the Vice Chair of the Human Rights Commission in Belmont, Ms. Kim Haley Jackson.
Thank you, Chloe. Can everyone hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
So my name is Kim Haley Jackson. I moved to Belmont in 2010. And just for some clarification to everyone on the panel, my family and I lived about 20 minutes away from Ferguson. So the relationship between the communities and the police was not very healthy, very abusive, and also illegal, as we found out once we moved. I will say in Belmont, we've had very good relationships with police officers. I think there's more of a willingness to have a dialogue, but I think right now we've come to a point in history. I will say first off, I'm a mom. I have 3 kids, 2 who've gone through Belmont school system. 1 is a recent grad, and I have a 7th grader. What I will say, I would think that Belmont would think it does not have a problem because they tend to be liberal, or at least leaning toward that way. I've found a lot of allies in town, to be sure, and most of the time it's our allies that are the voices. I think now it's time for the youth and also people of color, marginalized communities within Belmont to sort of be the voice and the leaders of change in the town. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for that, Ms. Kim Haley Jackson, Vice Chair of the Human Rights Commission. We'll now be passing on to State Senator Will Brownsberger.
Thank you. We in the legislature, in both branches, the House and the Senate, share everyone's horror and anguish at what happened in Minneapolis and recognize it as part of a pattern that we need to struggle to address and continue to struggle to address, and that we certainly want to take the outrage and visibility of the event that's occurred and translate it into more progress. And so both branches are about doing that. Dave can talk a little bit about what's going on in the House. In the Senate, the president has asked Sonia Shang Diaz and myself to chair a working group to identify the things that we can do. And we've been meeting for hours most days over the past couple of weeks, and we're making progress. And we hope that we'll get some meaningful legislation on the table soon, and that we'll be able to meet the House's work and join with the House to put something significant on the governor's desk as soon as possible.
Thank you, Senator Brownsberger. Up next, we have the state representative, Mr. Dave Rogers.
Well, good evening, everyone. I want to thank Belmont Against Racism, the Belmont Media Center, Gilchrist, and Chloe Gilchrist. Congratulations on getting into Colby, a phenomenal college. And as Senator Brownsberger said, there is tremendous energy right now in the legislature to take on these big issues. And we did pass the sweeping criminal justice reform bill in a previous session that had a lot of great pieces to it, reducing mandatory minimum sentences, allowing for more diversion instead of jail, reducing the use of solitary confinement, and many other measures. But clearly we need to do more. And just this week, we're taking up a supplemental budget. An amendment was attached to the budget to make Juneteenth a holiday. And I noticed that the amendment was co-sponsored by the Speaker of the House. So that gives you an example of the kind of inclinations and energy and where we're headed now. There are a number of proposals put forth by the Black and Latino caucus in the House. And these are African-American, Hispanic-American legislators who are leading the effort, and they've put out a 10-point plan. It's easy to find. I can provide a link. There are a lot of sweeping, important proposals, and it has to be a conversation between the House, the Senate, but between all of you, the public. And I'm hearing from a lot of you, and I'm glad I am. And we have to engage with law enforcement, too, to get their input. And I would commend to anyone who hasn't read it, the statement by our Chief of Police, Jamie McIsaac, a wonderful statement that he put out after the terrible incidents in Minneapolis. But some of the ideas are, for instance, a duty to intervene. We were all horrified by what happened when there were 3 officers who did nothing to intervene. So we're talking about having a legal duty to intervene. We're talking about, of course, banning chokeholds. We're talking about training standards and many other proposals. And I filed a couple pieces of legislation with the senior most member of the Black and Latino caucus on the codifying the right of the public to record the police. There's case law on that, but this would codify it. Of course, they can't interfere with law enforcement, but they codifying the right to make recordings. So there is just tremendous energy. I'm very hopeful. You know, I often say out of periods of tumult come periods of reform. If you look at history, that has been true in America. We need to make it true again now. And so I say to people, given the difficult times we're living through, and I know it's hard on families, but take heart. And we will get through this period, and we will, in my opinion, we need to use it as a pivot point to make significant changes to attack this 400-year history in America of racism. And so I look forward to the conversation this evening.
Thank you, Representative Rogers, and to all the panelists for speaking and introducing yourselves and for being here tonight. To introduce myself, my name is Chloe Park, and I'm a recent graduate of Belmont High School and will be attending Dartmouth College this fall. I'd first like to thank Belmont Against Racism, Belmont Human Rights Commission, and Belmont Media Center for hosting this discussion and for having me. I'm honored to be here, and as someone that grew up in Belmont and attended Belmont Public Schools, I'm excited to be part of the anti-racism conversations in this town and to bring to light the microaggressions and racial discriminations that exist in this town and to progress beyond it. I hope that every Belmont community member continues to participate in these important discussions to help create a more racially equal society. And with that, we will now take your questions. So to ask a question, please raise your hand by clicking on the participants icon at the bottom of your screen, at the Zoom screen, and you should be able to see a button to raise your hand. You will then enter a waiting list, and once it is time for your question, we will ask you to unmute your microphone, and you may address a specific panelist or ask a broad question for any panelist to answer. We request from you that the questions be brief as a courtesy to others, and we will make an effort to have questions equally distributed and posed to all of our panelists. Thank you. So first we have Alex Matthews.
Hi, I'm a Belmont resident, and this is a question for Chief McIsaac. Can you guys hear me? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. Chief McIsaac, I would like to hear your perspective on a couple of topics. One, pretextual stops and whether you feel they are a valid use of police power. And two, qualified immunity and whether you think that is appropriate for your officers in situations where they are charged with abuse of rights. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, I had to be unmuted. So your question was, it was difficult to hear you. Was it pretextual stop? What was the stops one?
Sorry, it was asking you whether you think that pretextual stops are an appropriate use of police power.
What do you, can you just give me an example of what you mean by that?
A pretextual stop being a stop where you stop a member of the public and the reason that you give to them for the stop is false and not why you in fact stopped them. Yeah. But nonetheless, you proceed to a search. This is a practice that has been endorsed as constitutional by the Supreme Court.
And proceed to a search, that would never happen it doesn't, we can't do that. Basically, the Ryan can tell you, we don't just pull people over and search their motor vehicles, not in Massachusetts. You know, we don't, I can't think of anyone in my department or in my time on the job when we made up reasons to stop people because we wanted to simply search their vehicle. And the qualified immunity, situation. I mean, that's, I think that's, above my pay grade. That's going to be decided by the legislator or by the, it's something that it affects all town officials. And I'm really, I don't know we're talking, as I said earlier, I want to help Belmont. If they want to do something with qualified immunity, that's fine on the state level. I'm more concerned about what goes on within the confines of the community of Belmont.
Thank you.
Just maybe to add to a little bit to that, the doctrine of qualified immunity is something that we're trying to get our arms around. But there's a lot of technicalities, but we think we have an approach to making sure that officers will not have immunity for a violation of force policies, which I think is doing away with qualified immunity. But here's what I want to say, though, that's interesting that that's sort of a step further that we haven't really talked through. In most communities, when an officer is charged with some kind of violation, the community is going to be sued as well, and the community is going to pay the settlement. So in practice, the officers are sort of, even if you take away qualified immunity, what you're doing is you are making it easier for people who have been victims of misuse of force to sue, and they're going to have a better recovery. But you're not necessarily changing the incentives for the police officers, because it's all going to be on the community taxpayers anyway. And so that issue of indemnification is one that has not got as much visibility, but some people are starting to talk about. And if you didn't indemnify officers, then they would have to carry their own insurance. And to some extent, they already do have to carry a little bit of a rider on their own personal liability insurance, but they'd have to be worried more about that. And then bad officers, who had complaints against them, would have to pay exorbitant insurance costs. And so there's a proposal out there, which I haven't really decided what I think about, to try to move in that direction and to bring the insurers into the picture of monitoring police conduct by saying, look, it's going to cost you $100,000 a year if you want to continue being a police officer based on the way you've treated people over the last 5 years. We think you're a walk-in lawsuit. We don't want to insure you. And that officer is going to go out of the business. So that's a different way of approaching police conduct management. But it's not something that's too developed yet. It's an interesting idea. That's why I wanted to put it out there. I don't want to necessarily put it out there as something that I think is right about to happen, though.
Thank you both. Thank you both of you for that response, Chief McIsaac and Senator Brownsberger. I believe we have a question from Jason Berger.
Oh, sorry. Was Meredith trying to raise your hand earlier? I think she had that before me. Sorry.
My role is to tell them how many questions are in line.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you were raising your hand.
No, okay.
Sorry, I'll get to my question then. Apologies for that. I had a question mostly for Mary and Ryan. So you spoke in your intro about your Transparency Through Data initiative. And I've been poking around your website for like the past week or so looking at this. I'm a little surprised that I can only find you tracking one indicator, that is, the bail of the last year. And in 2018, you looked at county bail data and also a youth diversion program, but you don't have any racial or socioeconomic breakdowns of that. You said you turned your data over to Northeastern, and they're doing a report which has yet to come out about 2 years later. And so I wanted to ask you, will you be making this data available before then? Because obviously a report like that takes, years. And also if you'll be tracking any other indicators to sort of give a more expansive transparency initiative, or if this is what your vision of transparency is.
No. So the good news is that we expect to start getting data from Northeastern very shortly. And it's going to come in waves. And we have been clear from the beginning that whatever that data is, we're going to be making that available. And we are always looking at what are other sets that we could be tracking reliably. One of the good things, for instance, about this pandemic has been, as we've come to agreements about releasing people on certain conditions, people who would normally have been held, because we needed to reduce the numbers in the institutions, and we've been imposing conditions and things like that. We've been very carefully tracking who's been being released, what kind of conditions are they on, how successful are they? Because it's my expectation that we will then use that to be able to increase the number of people we're able to release on bail. In addition to the fact that we now do not seek cash bail unless we're going to be seeking a jail sentence at the end of the case. So yes, more data to come.
I'm sorry, but I mean, like in terms of other indicators, like you're still only tracking bail data. You know, I mean, lots of other municipalities, counties, states track things like, I mean, defendants under 18 prosecuted as an adult, percentage of felonies resolved at trial, failures to pay court fees and fines, nonviolent felonies sentenced to prison. You know, there's a whole litany of social indicators that are being tracked in other places. And
Yep.
do you have any intentions of tracking that?
Yes, yes. And we have been, one of the sort of handicaps in all of that has been that all of us statewide are hooked into the same case management system, if you will. It's not really a tracking system. And we've been really using some outside resources to create ways that we can track some of those things, because we just do not in the foreseeable future see the state having the funding to change that tracking system. So we have modified it to track race, to track diversion, to see who's getting diversion. We're going to continue to grow that.
So when do you think those changes would actually happen, or like what's preventing those sorts of data gatherings from coming to us, you know?
So we continue to grow that. We began that probably about a year and a half ago, and we are increasing the numbers that we're able to track.
All right. Thank you, Jason Barger, for that amazing question, and also thank you for DA Ryan for that response. I personally have a question for Chief McIsaac. What are some of the steps the Belmont Police Department and yourself taking to bridge the gap between the community and the police department?
Thank you, Gilchrist. So, well, we do a number of things. As you know, we have, we talk about juveniles first. We have SROs. We have an officer in the middle school. Myself, I run a middle school football program. I have since 2014. We have one of our detectives is an assistant hockey coach. Two other officers here had coached with me on the middle school football team. So we like to get out. I encourage the officers to get out and get in the community outside of a uniform. The other thing we do is we participate in things in the community and try to reach out to as many people as possible, being available to people and listening to people's concerns and what they want to see from the police department. So it's ongoing. It's something that's, you know, sometimes events will take you away from it and you'll find your focus shifting a little bit, in a different direction. But that's the mainstay and the backbone of community policing, especially in a community like Belmont. And it's just getting out to know people and, you know, and being there for them when they need you.
Thank you. A follow-up for that question. Do you think the department and yourself would be maybe willing or open to having a student group, maybe a couple students from the high school and maybe even a couple eighth graders? Do you think that we could use that, a working student group, and, you know, if it's bi-weekly or something along those lines, having these conversations between the department and some of the teenagers, the young folks of the town?
Absolutely. That's a great idea. You know, I've given it some time, but Mitchell Pereira, who's one of the kids who organized the protest in Belmont Center, you know, I coached him in middle school football and he coached with me last year. And so, you know, I have every intention to reach out to Mitchell and see about, you know, organizing something, but I think that's a great idea. And it's good. It's good for our officers to hear your perspective, you know, to hear the perspective from kids in the community and what they think about the police and what they would like to see, how they would like to see us, you know, perform. I think that's an excellent idea.
Thank you very much, Chief McIsaac.
Thank you, Gil, for your question, and to Chief McIsaac for your response. We have a question from Shauna Daniel Collins.
Hi, so just to follow up on that question, I actually raised my hand and took it down. We were going along the same lines, but wanted to find out from the chief. I'm a big believer in community policing, so I applaud your efforts in that regard. But wanted to find out if there are any formal programs, training initiatives going on with the Belmont Police to heighten awareness of dealing with diverse populations, diversity in all areas. You know, economic diversity, racial diversity. You know, I know that there are different neighborhoods in Belmont that are even set up differently, multiple family houses versus single family housing. Are there any types of initiatives that are in place or plans to put those in place in the near future?
Sure, there absolutely are. We've been, you know, since the Ferguson shooting in 2014, that's when, you know, I had never even heard of the term implicit bias before 2014. And as a result of that, there's been training on that with the officers. Our officers received training in de-escalation. They received training in dealing with people with autism. And we're certainly aware of the different neighborhoods in the community. I grew up in a two-family in Belmont. I live in a two-family in Belmont. And I feel people's pain with the overnight parking rules, you know, about having to move multiple vehicles. So, you know, we're certainly aware of all the different dynamics within the community. And our officers receive, you know, training on all those areas. And we're going to continue. We're going to even receive more training. We try to identify officers that we think might need a little bit more special training. I've talked before about de-escalation. Sometimes comes natural to some people. Communicating with people comes naturally to some others. Other people need work at it. And, you know, we try to, through our supervisors, we try to identify those officers that need certain training. But we're absolutely gonna, you know, right away, we've already, as you can imagine, you know, there's people, we've been inundated with different kinds of trainings on diverse cultures, bias training. So we're signing people up to take as many courses as we can in those areas.
Thank you.
Just to go to the quality of the training that the officers get, we've brought Dr. Etienne Dror from England, one of the foremost authorities in the world, as well as Judge Bennett, a federal judge from the Midwest, two really worldwide experts to train our police departments on implicit bias. We also do cultural competency trainings every year for the police department, so they get a good sense of all of that.
By the way, just to mention real quick, the Criminal Justice Reform Act that we passed last year does require the Municipal Police Training Council statewide to develop a program in implicit bias issues, as well as de-escalation.
All right, thank you for your question, Shauna Daniel Collins, and for your responses to the panelists. Up next, we have MacGillivray. I apologize in advance if I mispronounce names.
That was really good, actually.
Good.
But my wife has a question.
Yes, sorry. This is Sarah MacGillivray, signed in as Mike. So piggybacking on the question about community involvement, I'm hearing a lot about the police interacting with high school students that are engaged in sports, but I'm wondering what is being done for the students that are not engaged in sports and the community at large, because the Belmont sports program covers some of the kids, but clearly doesn't cover all of the kids, and it definitely doesn't cover the whole community.
Of course. And so we've tried to involve ourselves in as much parts of the community as we can. A school resource officer at the high school. I think Chloe and Gilchrist could probably talk about what that's like. She's basically, Melissa O'Connor is basically a part of that community. She goes to prom, she goes to the dances, she goes to the plays, all that kind of stuff. that makes them available. We're looking any other time people want to get together, we'll supply offices so that people can meet. In sports, I think historically has provided an opportunity because there's people getting together there. But we're willing to, I'm willing, and people willing to get involved in any other way that we can with different communities within our community. And things that of interest to people.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question. Great question right there. And just piggybacking on that, definitely I think that could be a focus for the police department. Obviously, the great work that you guys do with the sports programs, whether it's, I know Officer O'Connor coaches one of the girls soccer team, and she's always involved community-wide. And I know you guys, you coach for the 8th grade football team. I think definitely a focus going forward for the police department and the community can be building those bridges sports. And obviously, we cannot take away the great work that you guys do within sports, but diversifying that and reaching out to different crowds. And I think the more we talk about it, the student group keeps coming up, and definitely, I think that's something we could work with. And going forward, I'm excited to see what we can come up with, obviously, with the police department and the high school and other students.
I think that would be great.
Yeah, one of the suggestions that a friend had brought up to me actually was that similar to how Miss Landry, who is the school's librarian, started a digital citizenship class to talk about good etiquette when you are online. Similar, that could be similarly applied to Officer O'Connor, because a lot of people who do sports, to reiterate what Miss MacGillivray's question was about diversifying the police and student relationship and police and Belmont community relationship. Maybe that Ms. O'Connor could maybe host a class or some sort of discussion about racism in Belmont High School, because I think we are all mature enough to have that conversation to talk about police brutality. I think that could be a really interesting thing to delve into, and I'd love to know your thoughts about that.
I think that's a super idea. As I said from the beginning, we don't have all the answers. I certainly don't. And, and we can't do it alone. And I've said before too, I've encouraged people to respectfully challenge the police department. And, this is great. This is like, I don't know, I think Representative Rogers said it. Sometimes from tragedy, there's an opportunity to grow. And I think that this is a perfect example of that. I would absolutely be, be all for that. Right.
Thank you. We have a question from Alana Goot.
Hi, thank you so much. So nationally, there has been a call to remove police presence from schools as it leads to higher for students of color. So in police presence from school, obviously that's kind of antithetical to what you just spoke about, but I know that that is in the interest of a lot of people. And additionally, for the state representatives, has there been any legislation proposed to remove police presence in public schools statewide? And if not, why not?
Senator Rogers, would you like to take that?
Yeah, I'm candidly unaware if whether there's currently pending legislation to require or mandate that all school resource officers be removed. Sometimes there is a hesitation to impose a one-size-fits-all law on. There are 351 cities and towns in the Commonwealth, and so the Mass Municipal Association, which is a very influential organization, they represent cities and towns. They'll often resist solutions that make every town comply. But, I think we're living through a moment right now where we have to have, there can be no sacred cows. And we're going to have hard conversations. And so I think, your question gets to one more issue that's out there now that folks ought to be able to talk about with a level head in a rational way, looking at data, looking at information and what makes the most sense for society. If you either in the chat or want to email me or call me after, I'll get back to you with details. I can look up whether there is any currently pending legislation. And thanks for the question.
Could I add to that a little bit?
Yep.
This was an issue that we discussed and did quite a bit about in our 2018 criminal justice reform package. We first of all decriminalized the offense of disturbing a school assembly, so that children would not be arrested and charged for just sort of routine acting out at school, which was happening in some communities. So that was a big, long time battle, and that was a big step forward. And the other thing we did was add language to the definition of a school resource officer that requires schools to have a memorandum of agreement with the police department that makes clear that the police officer's role is safety and teaching as opposed to being sort of an auxiliary disciplinarian. So that all was thought to me a big step forward and to sort of appropriately define the role of school resource officers. So and by the way, that's based, the motivation for that was really a few communities where the school resource officer, where there was sort of a school to prison pipeline thing going on, where a lot of kids were being ejected from school and charged with offenses. There was a study by the ACLU that put that on a few communities as an issue. And so we did take action on that. And so I think the situation may be better in those communities. I don't think there's a move to completely get rid of school resource officers, because some schools really want and need them for different reasons, but they should have their appropriate role. I'm going to try to put in the chat a link to the language that we have. There is one other piece of legislation that's pending that we're talking about that would make sure that the ratio of sort of social work resources being assigned to help kids to school resource officers was X, that the investments being made in helping resources, guidance counselors, psychologists, social workers, instead of police officers. But I think that really covers in some respects the same territory that we covered by this memorandum of agreement that's supposed to define the role of school resource officers. I'm going to put in the chat a link to the relevant language in just a minute.
Could I say something? So I think, obviously we hear this national push to get the school resource officer out of the school, and that it was kind of touched on. You can't compare what goes on in Belmont to what goes on in some other community. I don't know what they do over there, but I can tell you that our school resource officer is I would never put somebody in the school that was out to hurt kids or to somehow impact them in a negative way. And having a school resource officer, I'll just give you a simple example. So I have 3 kids that went through the Belmont Public Schools. If they were ever the victim of a crime in the school or whatever, I would rather have them be able to go to a school resource officer that they know and that they can trust and talk to them about it. Because otherwise, the only other option is you send the officer of the day down to the school to take a report, whether a cell phone got stolen or something like that. And as Will said, they're there for another purpose. We participate in C4RJ, Communities for Restorative Justice. If there was ever an incident or something like that, we would use that. And basically, we don't get into disciplining the kids at the school. It basically everything is handled by the school. Any kind of those kinds of things that would traditionally go on in the school.
All right, thank you, Alana, for your question, and to our panelists for answering. On the topic of education, I'd like to ask Ms. Kim Haley Jackson on how the Human Rights Commission in Belmont is working to address the discrimination in our education system in terms of staff and the curriculum. If you guys have any policies or ideas towards that.
So sure. We do have a liaison at the high school, so both an adult and student liaison. So if we're aware of an issue, we will try to coordinate sort of face-to-face, or if it's an institutional issue, speak with the principals at school about the issues. However, we as the Human Rights Commission aren't always aware of what goes on at the school level. I can tell you that currently I am looking at ways to diversify the curriculum at Belmont. I think that that would be helpful in kind of breaking down some of the racial barriers. I think that you, Gilchrist, and certainly my daughter and my son have experienced at the schools. Typically the schools, what I've seen, don't necessarily come through HRC. If I may give a personal example to the group,
could you repeat that?
And
could you repeat?
One was elementary.
Sorry.
Sure.
Could you repeat what you just said? Yeah.
Okay. So 2 out of my 3 children experienced issues within the Belmont school system, one in elementary and the other in high school. Both were taken care of at the school level, because at that point we were not aware that the HRC provided that sort of assistance. So I think what's going to happen, what I would like to happen coming in as vice chair, that the schools start to lean on us and bar more often as students come to them with these issues.
Yeah, and just a follow up with that. You mentioned that there is a student liaison, a couple actually, that work with the Human Rights Commission. To be quite honest, I didn't know that we did have a liaison. So part of the question is, and you bring up the faculty, and there's kind of a disconnect between the school and the commission. Do you think there's a way we could bridge that, whether it's a faculty, student, and the commission group, or something along those lines? But is there a way for a common Belmont High School student to know that an issue to do with the race or anything along those lines does not have to be settled in school, but it could, the conversation could be had at a bigger level? Do you think there's anything there?
I do. I've sort of walked through my experience and looked at what I felt would be most effective, right? So, well, we have a high school liaison and we have 2 student liaisons, right? And so, you know, what I've found is the information that we receive from the students is sort of, it's dependent on their experiences, right? So we're sort of missing that administrative piece. And so what I've done is outreach to some administrators at the high school who've been great in my 10 years here in Belmont, and asked them to come to HRC and participate. I would like the students to feel like they have an ally outside of the school system should they have an issue, right? And in town, go to school, and I don't know if that's part of a packet, or, you know, we sort of talk with the counselors or the vice principals, like, to notify the HRC. Right now, that I think having gone through enough, right, there is some validity in HRC stepping in and maybe trying to assist in some of these more sensitive issues.
Thank you so much for your response. And thank you to all of the patient people waiting in line for your questions. We will get to you. But right now we have Michael Collins. I will unmute.
Thank you very much. So I have a couple of related questions for Will and Dave, which really, I think, go to the heart of having policies and laws to sort of back up good intentions. A couple of weeks ago, Chief McIsaac at a select board meeting talked about how much of a challenge it is to hire qualified minorities to the force because of civil service laws. And I think you all are aware of the fact that Will and Dave, I'm sure, that public employees have the benefits now of both civil service and union protection. And so is there any sort of, kind of legislative will to try to sort of basically end civil service so that the chief can do what he would like to do, which he stated 2 weeks ago, which is to hire more qualified minorities into the force. And that's an issue not just in Belmont, but in every other community. Secondly, in general, in terms of bringing more diversity to the town workforce, why can't we use local aid formulas to establish sort of incentives for folks in communities that if they meet certain targets for making their public workforce more diverse, that positively their local aid distribution? Thank you.
Dave, do you want to go first, or shall I jump on that?
You can jump in and I'll piggyback on your observations.
So Mike, I think that's definitely part of the conversation right now is what can we do about making it easier for, to create a more diverse workforce. Dave and I have one bill that comes straight out of the Belmont Police Force that I think is in pretty good shape, which would allow anybody who's been gone to high school in Belmont or was living in Belmont at the time they went to high school to be on the force, whether or not they actually live in Belmont or not. So that would enable METCO students who come to Belmont to be on the force and also accommodate people who just can't afford to come back to town to live in, who grew up here. So that's one easy thing we're doing, or easier thing. The civil service conversation is a big one, though. You get into the whole thing with veterans and you fight a big battle about that. So I actually, I think we're talking about that, but I think our top priority right now, as I see it, is to speak to the use of force issues and the accountability and the barriers to full accountability that civil service may impose. So not eliminating civil service out of the hiring process, which raises a whole new, lot of different problems. But I think the thing that we can do first is to say, look, if an officer is found to have violated use of force policies or other serious misconduct, then they will lose a certification and be unable to work in Massachusetts, and that will not be appealable to the Civil Service Commission, or nor to collective bargaining. They will just be out of work.
Will, I understand the heavy lift of doing something with civil service, and I appreciate the challenge of that. But it frankly just strikes me that and I'm sure that the veterans sort of deserve some consideration, but that factor in both hiring and promotion basically kind of perpetuates endlessly structural racism.
Well, and it not only does that, but it also kind of gives a preference for people who are likely survivors of trauma themselves, and may have spent time fighting their way through cities in some foreign country, shooting everything that moved, or making different decisions on a different sort of basis, and it's just not it's not always the best training for being a police officer now. So it's a complicated conversation, and one that we are having, but over the next 6 weeks between now and the end of July, my priority is the use of force issues.
Okay. Yeah, and I would add that I mentioned at the outset that the Black and Latino Caucus of Legislators has an agenda they put forward. The Civil Service Exam Review is part of that. And as I also said, there really can't be sacred cows right now. We're living through a moment when we have to have frank conversations about difficult subjects. And as Will said, I think in the near term, there's a growing consensus around a certain bundle of reforms that we can do in the near term. But I can tell you with the caucus of legislators, my colleagues, we're looking at that as a first phase, and that there needs to be follow-on reforms that come from it. I think the civil service piece, it would probably come in a second phase, but it has to be looked at. And union contracts have to be looked at. I mean, there have been controversies in communities, including in Arlington, where there was a belief that an officer who had published really horrible racist things couldn't be terminated because through the arbitration and union grievance process, that person would win, and then you'd have an aggrieved officer who'd won their arbitration still on force. So we need to look at that. The final thing I'll say is part of this is a procedural thing too that I think you all should know about, and that is we're not physically in the State House right now. We are literally voting from our living rooms because of physical distancing. And as a consequence, legislation that's complex and controversial will be tough to move from a distance. In other words, there are parliamentary tactics that we can use in the majority as Democrats that are tough to use when we're voting over a telephone. And so for some of those trickier pieces, we have to get after them. They have to be on the table, but they might be difficult given how we're actually voting. And that's a parliamentary issue.
Okay, thank you both. I guess the only thing I would say in conclusion is, I appreciate the fact that we need to focus on what's doable in the near term, but, the last 30, 40, 50 years or longer is a history of sort of us forgetting about the long term. So I hope that you all will kind of keep that in mind. We've urged that of the select board. We've urged that, of both of you, because I think if we don't focus on the long term, that all of this will be, frankly, transitory.
Before we continue, I know the scheduled programming says we should be wrapping this up at 8, but first of all, thank you for the panelists. You guys are doing a wonderful job of really giving us an insight of everything and how we can really move on as a community. But I'll just give you guys a heads up. We do, and people with questions, we have a couple questions left, but we do have some extra time allotted, and we have, I think, 3 or 4 questions left. So we're going to continue right on with the show. And the next question is coming from Daniel Zhang.
Hi, you guys can all hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I would just like to thank all the panelists for participating in such a needed conversation in social change and racial change. My question is addressed to Senator Brownsberger and Representative Rogers. So in the wake of George Floyd's death, we've seen a national rise in this call to defund the police, right? So what are your opinions, respective opinions on defunding the police, right? So should we defund the police completely, not defund the police at all? Is the policy a one-size-fits-all type of policy, or is it based off of each county, each city? And in Massachusetts Congress, is there an appetite for defunding the police? And if so, what specific legislature is being drawn up or seen or has been passed regarding defunding the police?
I'm happy to
go ahead, Dave, and I'll follow you.
Yeah, so I don't want to sound like a broken record repeating myself, but I think everything has to be on the table in terms of a conversation, a dialogue. Now, I'm not even sure what defund the police means. And it's a vague term. If people mean scrutinize law enforcement budgets to see where there's excessive spending or arguably excessive spending, and taking that money and diverting it to social services and job training and in reinvesting in low-income neighborhoods or communities of color to help lift people up. That's a great conversation. And again, we have to have these hard conversations. But on the other hand, of course, we need law enforcement in our society. So if by completely defund the police, I would not support that. And finally, I am in politics and I am a Democrat, and that whole term is a gift to Donald Trump. And so I'm a left liberal. I really am a progressive, but we also have to be thoughtful about how we have these conversations. I really think that kind of rhetoric is not helpful to the goal, the biggest goal that I have come November. And so I just want to say that.
Yeah, I mean, I would basically agree. I mean, look, to the extent that when I think the term defunding is a disastrous term, right? Because I agree with Dave on that, because there's no way that's what we actually think. I don't think there's what anybody really, I mean, I'm sorry, I shouldn't speak for other people, but there's very few people who really think that we don't need police officers, period. I mean, on any given day, there's a chance in a community that something dreadful is going to happen where you really do want some brave men and women to step up to the plate and defend the community. And they do that. I mean, Watertown and Belmont, we went through a 9/11, the marathon bombing, and we need police officers. And you need to, and they're a standby resource, meaning that, at any given time, you have to have several of them in town in case something bad happens. And that means that they're 24/7, and you got to staff shifts and support that process. And you have a police department that you're funded once you sort of take all that into consideration, and you have to do that long before you get to the question of who would I rather send to a mental health call? Well, yeah, I might rather send a social worker, but guess what? At 3 a.m, the person who's available in town is a police officer, and they have to be there. They're paid for. You can't get rid of that funding. So I'm all for trying to find more helping resources and to respond to community problems in a lighter touch way. And I think the thing that the DA was saying was extremely important, the idea of not arresting people for minor offenses. It's when you use force and arrest people that you get into trouble. Just give people a ticket. So what the police do and what the law mandates that the police do, I think we can look at that. But defunding the police is not a useful term. And just one last thing on that. When you talk about it at a state level, I mean, at a city level, it's a small portion of the budget. At a city level, the police are 5-10% of the budget. It's not like you could get rid of the police and then you'd have a whole lot of money. At the state level, it's even less. I mean, 2/3, 3/4 of the state budget is health, education, and welfare, mostly going to communities of poverty already. That is what the state that is the values that are expressed in the state budget. They are helping values. That is what the state budget is about. The state police is about 1% of the state budget, and there's another 1.5 or 2% that goes to corrections. But altogether, 1%, 2%, 3%, depending on what you want to include in that. So I'm not a fan of defunding the police or even using that phrase, but I do think where we can, finding ways to use helping resources, and in some instances that is going to mean shifting resources.
Thank you, Daniel, for your question, and to Representative Rogers and Senator Brownsberger for your responses. We have 2 final questions, and I'd ask everyone else to hold off. Thank you for everyone for coming. And we have 2 more questions. So first we have Mike MacGillivray.
Hi, yeah. I want to say thank you to everybody for putting on this conversation, and I hope that we can gather again and continue this conversation. My question kind of touches on what was just talked about a little bit in terms of budgets, but also goes back a little bit to having police in the schools. And it's kind of for all the panelists. And I was hoping that, or wondering what people think about sort of what is the goal and purpose of officers in schools. The link that was shared had language about, officers are not there to replace psychiatrists or social workers or school counselors, and are also not there to be disciplinarians. So I'm curious what the role of a police officer in the school actually is, if it's not any of those things, and why those resources and funding wouldn't be better spent on more social service type positions.
I can take the first part. So in 2019, we had 265 calls for service at the Belmont High School. Of course, some of those were in the summer. They were alarm calls. The SRO, I believe, answered 164 calls for service in 2019 at the Belmont High School. Now, if she wasn't at the high school, a police officer would be showing up down there. And one of the great resources that the school resource officer is when she took over that position, one of the things I said to her, I was the assistant chief at the time, I said, Melissa, I want you to know every kid in the school. So that if we have a problem or we have something, we can say, Melissa, this is the student, tell us about it. Is this someone we should charge? Is this someone that we should look for a different thing? And that's what's happened. We've had kids that have said things that are not appropriate regarding, whether it's a gun at the school or a threat or something like that. She knows the kid. She knows what kind of maybe if there's underlying issues and that stuff. And they've handled it successfully with the schools and gotten kids the services that they need and keep them out of trouble. If the SRO isn't there, you get the officer of the day goes down there and they consult with whoever is in charge at the police station that day on a shift, and you probably end up charging a kid. Or you end up closing school for a day until you bring in everybody to search the entire building because you don't know anything about this person. We talk about police being in communities. You have 1,000 kids at the high school. You want a police officer in that community and to be part of that community. And, it takes a special person as an SRO. We're very fortunate that we have one who is excellent at what she does at the high school. And also talking about the other communities beyond sports, she went on a trip to Peru with one of the classes. I mean, those are the kinds of things that she does and she's there for. And the teachers appreciate having her around. I know the staff does. I know the principal does. She's helped organize different events, whether they're at, outside of the school. So I think she's just a tremendous resource to the school here in Belmont. That's basically how we see it. It's a resource for us. Otherwise, you get the officer of the day goes down there. We've had incidents on the weekends. We had kids that broke into the middle school and had alcohol. 10 years ago, those kids would have got charged with beanie in the nighttime and minor in possession with alcohol. Melissa was able to bring the parents into the school. They were able to talk. They had discipline from the school. They had absolutely no involvement with the criminal justice system whatsoever. And those kids are better off for that. And if we didn't have Melissa and we didn't know, we hardly knew Isaac Taylor at all, the principal of the school, or the case I'm talking about was Dan Richardson, those kids would have got charged. They would have been down at court the next day, and who knows what would have happened.
I could tell another story like that. I think I can tell this story without breaching anybody's confidence. But there was a case that I got called in on when I was a defense attorney some years ago, where a young high school student was selling the prescription, opiates that he'd gotten from his dental care, and he was selling them at the school. And that could have been like a 2-year felony. I mean, it was a serious offense on paper, but it was just the most innocent, silly thing to have done. And the police research officer, interviewed him, and it never hit the screen of the criminal justice system. It was just so well handled. So I mean, these things, they can be helpful as opposed to harmful to have a good officer responding to situations that happen in the school.
Thank you, Mike MacGillivray, and to all of our panelists again. To respect everyone's time before we move on to our last question, I'd like to ask our panelists to keep responses concise before we summarize the points of the discussion and start to wrap up this event. Thank you again. And here is the last question from Jason Berger.
Hi, I realize this is my second question of the evening, so I'll be quite brief and direct with it. Earlier on this call, the district attorney mentioned that she publishes reports and all the findings on every police shooting in the county to her website. And so on that note, I went and I checked her website, and I don't see anything on Alan Greeno, who was shot and killed by police more than 2 years ago. So to Marion, I ask, I don't know if you're familiar with the case off the top of your head, but when will you be publishing the report and findings of a man killed in February of 2018 by police? You're muted, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, sorry. I'm very familiar with that, and that is still an ongoing case. So that's why we haven't finished with that case.
All right.
Okay, thank you. I checked the news and there hadn't been any releases on that. It was quite surprising.
Thank you for that question, Jason, and thank you for your response, DA Ryan. First of all, personally, I think I'd be remiss if I did not acknowledge the wonderful job that Officer O'Connor does down at the high school. I personally know her, and just kind of going on with Chief McIsaac's point, she does a wonderful job down there. I think I have to give her a shout out. And just to wrap up, kind of some key points that some key takeaways. I think something that we have to be working on moving forward, and I think myself and Chloe would be more than happy to work with you, Chief McIsaac, going forward. A student group with the police department and finding ways in which the police department can work in direct contact with students outside of sports. Again, you guys do a wonderful job in terms of the sports world, but how can we make that bigger than the sports world? Because obviously not everyone in Belmont is talented enough to play football, I myself being one, but definitely focusing on other areas. And again, touching on same thing with policing, a point was brought up with community policing, and again, the policy of maybe making it possible so that ex-Belmont High School students who have lived and grown up in Belmont can apply and work for the force. I think those 2 points go hand in hand because I think the idea of community policing can be very hard to grasp, but I think a small step that we can take in the fight for community policing can be having people that have grown up, have lived in Belmont, police our town, because again, who knows this town better than the people who went to high school at Belmont High School, than the people who went to the elementary schools here or the middle schools. So that's definitely something I'm interested to see what the department does. And I think that's a conversation we should be pushing for. And the last big point that came up, which comes from the Human Rights Commission, that is, again, bridging the gap between the administration and the students with the Human Rights Commission. My take on what has been happening, it's been separate, two separate entities, the Human Rights Commission and the school administration. I think going forward, what we really want is two groups that work together, because I think those two groups working together is going to be more effective than not. So I think a suggestion or recommendation going forward, and again, Chloe and I would be more than willing to work out with the Human Rights Commission going forward, is putting a committee together of administrators and students and seeing what we can do with that. Because I definitely, and I agree with Ms. Kim Haley, having a disjointed conversation is going to be hard going forward. And I think it's very important for us to have a roundtable conversation when all of us are there, meaning administrators, students, and the commission. That's going to be it for me. Chloe's going to take over. Again, I'd like to thank everyone for doing this. And Chloe?
Yeah, first I'd like to thank the panelists for being here. Again, that is Middlesex District Attorney Marion Ryan, Belmont Police Chief James McIsaac, Ms. Kim Haley Jackson, who is the Vice Chair of Human Rights Commission, Vice Chair of the Human Rights Commission in Belmont, William Brownberger, the State Senator, and Dave Rogers, the Massachusetts State Representative. And of course, I would like to thank the participants who have attended, asked questions, and listened to this important discussion. This conversation tonight was a small but important step towards the right direction, and the conversation about anti-racism cannot stop here. We have a long way to go before we can achieve a truly a community that is racially equal. And of course, I'd like to thank Belmont Against Racism, the Belmont Human Rights Commission, and the Belmont Media Center for making this discussion possible tonight. And thank you all again for attending. And if anyone else, Meredith or Kathryn, if you'd like to add anything before we go.
No, well, two things. First, again, thank you to all of our panelists. This has been a good conversation. Belmont Against Racism would like to continue these conversations. And so going forward, we hope to partner again with the Media Center and the Commission. And hopefully we will continue these conversations while people's attention are on this subject. Sometimes it's a moment. And as folks have been saying, now's the time for change. So we hope to do more. Thank you. And if people are interested or have ideas for us, please let us know at belmontagainstracism@gmail.com. Thank you.
And I would just like to say, as a representative of Belmont Media Center, if people have ways they would like to have Belmont Media Center help to prolong and engage conversation around these issues, please contact us. Thank you.
That's going to be it for us. Have a good night, guys. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.